Good morning, Holman High School students. As many of you know, February is Black History Month. We honor Black History Month by recognizing the generations of African Americans that struggled and persevered to gain equality, celebrating the accomplishments and contributions of African Americans, sharing their stories of overcoming adversity, and reflecting on the work that still needs to be done. Today, we are going to honor how African Americans in Wisconsin overcame adversity to achieve fair and equal housing laws. The details of this topic may sound familiar or come as a surprise to many of you. Out of respect for the African American experience in Wisconsin, please listen closely to their story. During the 1960s, Milwaukee was an epicenter in the nationwide struggle for civil rights. Activists and community members staged boycotts, led protests, and fought for legal protections against segregation in both education and housing. The main issue for African Americans in Milwaukee was passing an open housing law that didn't limit where a person could live based on race, disability, marital status, and so forth. In 1965, the governor passed an open housing law, but it was weak and it did not apply to landlords that owned fewer than 4 rental units. In Milwaukee, this was most landlords, so the law did little to nothing to actually provide fair and open housing. After repeated failure to pass a meaningful open housing bill, tensions heated up. On August 9, 1966, the main NAACP offices in Milwaukee were bombed by a member of the KKK. A couple weeks later, an 11-day protest began of the Eagles Club, a club consisting of prominent city officials with a whites-only clause for membership. Many members of the Eagles Club held positions of power that directly impacted fair and equal housing in the city of Milwaukee. On the third night, the National Guard was brought in to protect protesters from 4,000 white hostile counter-protesters. In this photo, you can see members of the NAACP Youth Council protesting the Eagles Club. The NAACP Youth Council and the members it consisted of were monumental behind this movement for civil rights. Here, members of the KKK stand across the street from the Eagles Club, while the NAACP Youth Council protests the club's whites-only policy for membership. Think to yourself, what do you think was the intention of the KKK showing up at this protest? As frustration across the African American community grew due to ongoing oppression, a riot broke out on the north side of Milwaukee. The National Guard was sent in to calm down the riot and stop looting. After the riot was over, 4 people died, 100 were hurt, and over 1,700 people were arrested. Following the riot, civil rights leaders staged an ongoing protest. From August 1967 to April 1968, activists marched for 200 nights to protest segregation of housing in the city of Milwaukee. The protests became known as the March on Milwaukee. The protesters, largely African Americans from the north side of Milwaukee, marched to the predominantly white south side. They were met by counter-protesters with violence and intimidation. White mobs threw bricks and bottles and displayed racist signs. The man leading the marches was Reverend James Groppe, advisor of the NAACP Youth Council and its Commando Security Unit. Reverend Groppe led the charge throughout the March on Milwaukee. On the second night of the marches, police threw tear gas into the NAACP Youth Council headquarters, also known as Freedom House. Police said they were responding to reports of a sniper, a claim that Reverend Groppe and the Youth Council disputed. The fire at Freedom House only emboldened and strengthened the efforts of the NAACP Youth Council. As the march went on, protesters on both sides continued to battle for or against equal housing rights for almost a year. This included rallies by white power groups with hate signs. In this photo, neo-Nazis marched along 16th Street on September 23, 1967. One of the influential drivers behind fair housing was Vel Phillips, the first African American and first woman on the Milwaukee Common Council, the city's legislative body. She introduced 3 separate bills for open housing, but they all failed to be passed. She even participated in the march and was arrested. Later, she went on to become Wisconsin's first African American judge. Her efforts were one of the driving forces behind eventually achieving open housing in Milwaukee. After the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., 1,000 students walked out of Division High School to attend a memorial service. At the service, Reverend Groppe urged a commitment to nonviolent protest. 3 days later, 14,000 to 25,000 walked down Wisconsin Avenue to honor Dr. King. The movement in Milwaukee ultimately helped lead to the passage of the Fair Housing Act, also known as the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which protects people from discrimination when buying or renting a home. Shortly after, Wisconsin finally passed a meaningful open house ordinance that can be accredited to the efforts of young people. As current University of Wisconsin-Madison professor Robert Smith states it, you need the exuberance and the invincibility of youth to dare the status quo to change. Every generation of young people has the opportunity to produce social change. What will yours be? From the previous quote, a status quo is an existing state of affairs, especially regarding political or social issues. In the 1960s, the youth of Milwaukee challenged the existing state of affairs and had to overcome numerous barriers to achieve their goals. As a class, you will answer the following questions after watching a video of former protesters reflecting on their experience 50 years after the marches. Your teacher will decide their preferred discussion format, such as think, pair, share, small group, or large group discussion. They may or may not also choose to write responses in a chart to organize your thinking. Next week, we will pick up where we left off by taking a look at the barriers home and high school youth have to overcome to achieve their own individual or group goals. Thank you for honoring the efforts of African Americans in Wisconsin by thinking critically about their efforts and experiences in the 1960s. Thank you.